Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. Today, we're going to take a look at the Long Island serial killings. And I have the man who really broke it wide open, John Ray, and his legal assistant, Lena Ajit. How you guys doing today?
Very well, thank you, Nick. Good to meet you.
Good.
Good
Thanks
to
for
meet
having
you.
us.
We've corresponded a bit, but we haven't really seen each other up close and personal.
Right.
I'm in the city. I'm 4 blocks away from Times Square. I believe you're in Long Island, right?
Yeah, but also in New York.
Also in New York?
Yes.
Without John's tenaciousness, there would be no apprehension of a Long Island serial killer. But there is a lot of information that the mainstream media and law enforcement have neglected to mention, either by commission or omission. So, as it stands now, 11 bodies have been found near the Gurgle Beach area, and Huerman has been charged with 6 murders. But John came to this because of Shannon Gilbert, who was one of the last prostitutes to be murdered by Huerman, or conceivably by Huerman, allegedly by Huerman. Could you tell us a little bit about that, John? How you met Shannon's family?
Yeah, sure. By coincidence, in some ways, I met Mary Gilbert. I was on a murder case representing the victims of another murderer named Laffer, who assassinated 5 people in a Medford, Long Island drugstore. And one of them had one of the women there who was killed had two little children, 2 babies, and they needed someone to speak for them at the sentencing of Laffer and his wife for the shootings. So I spoke on behalf of the children, and I took on the personality of the children. That's the approach that I used, and it was effective. So it influenced the press who was there, sitting in the jury box, by the way, and one of them, Steve Barcelo, who was working for the Daily News in New York. Uh, he asked me to, I knew him, but he asked me to meet Mary Gilbert, who was his friend. He had done some legwork on the case. And at that point, the police department had just made fools of themselves in claiming that Shannon Gilbert died by drowning, and Mary Gilbert didn't buy a bit of it. So she wanted help, and she wanted to get the police out of the case because they bungled it so badly, and she needed help on that. So I met her in a bar restaurant in over in Islip on Long Island with Steve Barcelo, and we became friends. And I agreed to help her out by simply calling a press conference in Oak Beach to uh, call for the police to step down and for the FBI to take over, the United States Attorney's Office, that is, to take over the case because it was bungled. And so I did that. We held a press conference, and I'm pretty good at getting the press when I need it. We got them there, and Mary and we held a joint press conference. I did that, what I said, and I got no response from the U.S. Attorney's Office. I sent them a letter, and meanwhile, I thought I was done with my work in that regard. That was the end of it. Except that several days later, after the press conference, and Shannon's remains had just been found only days before that, I got a letter unsolicited from a detective from the homicide squad in Suffolk County who rebutted what I had said at the press conference. His name was Vincent Steffen. He was, I believe, the vice president of the Detectives Union, or treasurer. Yeah, thank you.
And to put this in context, Shannon Gilbert went missing in May of 2010, and her remains were found in December of 2011.
That is correct. And
Okay.
in December of 2011. So I get this letter from this detective that sets forth all the errors that I made, according to him, in my press conference, and explained the 911 call that Shannon had made before she was murdered, and it explained it that Shannon was fine. The people who were there with her were all calm. Everybody was calm. There was no trauma. There was no threat of death. There was nothing at all like that. And Shannon was, according to him, therefore obviously confused and disoriented and probably on drugs, and that she died by accident. So when I got that letter, I was suitably incensed because it seemed like it was wrong. We didn't know what was on the tape. We had only their word. And I just let it be until a few days later, the police department published that letter in Newsday as a feature letter, and with one or two changes in it, but it was the same letter. And so it stirred me up now, because now they're saying I'm making up all this stuff, and I wasn't. So long and short, it motivated me to continue. And I spoke with Mary, and we both decided that I would continue in the work. And that's how it started. And I went from there to the autopsy report, which turned out to be very controversial. And then I walked the marsh at the same time and the same week that Shannon, except obviously, a year later, um, that Shannon would have walked if the police were telling the truth. And we found that there's no way she could have drowned, like they had said, or she could have died of natural causes. That was complete nonsense.
That
So that started it all.
that tape was sealed, and then a judge unsealed it. And could you tell us the particulars of that tape,
The
the
particulars
911
of,
call?
yeah, the tape itself became very controversial for years because police refused to release it, no matter what I did, and I had to sue them twice. In the second lawsuit, we won, and then they appealed it, and we won again on the appeal, and they were forced to give up the tape to me. But I already knew that what Detective Steffens said in writing on behalf of the police was wrong, because I had met with the medical examiner. I and Mary Gilbert and the family, the Gilbert family, that is, and the medical examiner who did the work, she claimed that there was controversy, there was shouting, there was trouble on the tape, and it was exactly contrary to what the police had said. So I knew there was a problem. When I finally got the tape, several problems came with it from the police department. They were supposed to give me the tape plus any other, transcripts of the tape that they would ordinarily make, especially in a big case like that. I was supposed to get the original, and then we could copy it or whatever would happen. But instead, when the detective sergeant from the homicide delivered the tape to my office, uh, nothing else was delivered with it. I asked him where are the other things you're supposed to give us. He said there were none. They did not have any. They never did a transcript of the tape, and the police department never did that. And they claimed that they didn't even have the original. They never had it. They claimed the state police had it, and so I had already subpoenaed the tape from the state police just in case. And sure enough, they write back and say, "Well, we do whatever the county tells us to do with the tape, but they don't have the tape either." So that the original tape is apparently gone, and we have copies of a copy. So that already should give you pause, and it certainly gave me pause. And when they didn't even do a transcript, you know that something's really wrong here. So we get the tape, and what's on that tape, most people who hear it, you're going to have a controversy. You're going to have those who say, along with the police department, that Shannon was confused, she was acting weirdly and strangely, and that she was irrational. And so, therefore, she was probably on drugs, and probably, therefore, went into hallucinations, and therefore, probably walked into an almost impenetrable marsh. Uh, I shouldn't say almost, impenetrable marsh, and managed to die of natural causes on May 1st, 2010, when the sun came up at about 5:45, and it was 60 degrees out and went all the way up to in the 70s that day. And she somehow died of natural causes that day, according to the police, by either drowning. That's what they originally said. Then changed that, said some other natural cause from the elements. And the elements didn't kill her. Some man killed her, or people killed her. And so back to the tape. So the tape itself, if you listen to it from the police perspective, you can say, well, she sounded like her voice was slurry a little bit here and there. What she said didn't make sense because what would she be doing in the house of a John named Joe Brewer and saying that someone is after me when she's there with him and her driver comes in and says, hey, what's wrong? Everything okay? And she said she accuses the driver of being in on the whatever conspiracy was going on. And so she acted irrationally and then suddenly bolted out of the house and ran away, knocking on doors. So she's obviously, according to that theory, she's not all there. And so we have to say that the police are probably correct. That's the theory if you buy the police's perspective of the tape. But that is not at all what is on that tape. First of all, there's no evidence of where Shannon had been right prior to them making that 911 call. But you know, a sex worker who uses secret names or fake names because they never like their identity to be known. They're scared stiff of the police department. Would rarely ever call 911 unless they were really in danger. And if you'll notice, if you listen to the tape, when she first calls, her very first statement is, someone is after me. She repeats that 3 times, once to the Suffolk County operator who takes the call, and twice to the operator that the call is transferred to from the state police. Someone is after me. Well, it wouldn't make sense that Brewer was after her if he was in the house with her and had been with her for 3 hours that night. So, of course, that sounds not rational, unless she had been outside the house and came in as a refuge from wherever she was and made the call while she was either moving in or in the house. That makes sense. And if you accept that as a possibility as to what happened, the rest of her call makes perfect sense. This was a scared, terrified girl who was threatened in her life and had to make a choice: stay in the house and risk getting killed there, trapped, or bolt and get caught outside by who's ever been after her, who was chasing her. And she made exactly the correct choice, the rational choice. She bolted. And when you hear her talk, one of the key phrases on the tape is kind of, several of them, but one of the key phrases is when she says, I never did it before, I'll never do it again. And so, of course, the police interpret that to be some kind of a drug. Of course, without any evidence of that. But could it be an activity that she never did before and she'll never do again? Makes more sense, doesn't it? And she of course then runs out, and you hear blood curdling screams from her right after she leaves that house. And you can hear a male voice make a grunt when the screaming takes place. And then she takes off, and you can hear her knocking on doors until she reaches a house of a man named Gus Coletti, who was very much connected with the community. I think he was the president of the association. And he answers the door, very hostile to her, very odd, since he claims he thought she was only a 14-year-old girl. And he treats her with extreme hostility. And you hear her say, it's very clear if you listen to it, it's you. She recognized somebody at Coletti's house, either Coletti himself or somebody with Coletti. And then she, of course, immediately runs once she recognizes whoever it is. So it's perfectly rational that she ran away. And then the next thing we know, no more tape. So that's a beginning. That's a genesis of this, and everything she did and said makes perfect sense if you take into account the possibility that some one person or group of people were outside and were she was involved with them. Was was she in a some kind of occultish celebration? Was she being chased by somebody who called himself a hunter, such as Horryman? Was she being chased by someone else? Hard to say, but not impossible to imagine, given what we know about the tape.
And the autopsy said she died from natural causes or a drug overdose or drowning. And you hired Michael Baden, probably the most famous medical examiner in the United States. And he found that her death was consistent with violence and homicide.
Well, okay, but the original ME medical examiner, Suffolk County's medical examiner, found that it was undetermined as to her death, as to the manner of her death, and the cause of her death. The ME never said she drowned. It was the police commissioner who claimed that Shannon had drowned, and he made that claim before her body was even located, and only after they had found her jeans, pocketbook, cell phone, and one or two other items in a sort of a semicircle behind Dr. Peter Hackett's home in the marsh, and about a third of a mile away from where her body was found. When I didn't hire Michael Biden, what I did is I convinced Michael to take the case pro bono, and like I was doing, and he and I were acquaintances of one another from when he had been a Suffolk County medical examiner many years before, and his brother Bobby played semi-professional football with me when I played for the Long Island Giants many years ago. So I was able to convince Michael because Bobby still worked with Michael on autopsies that he would step into the case, and he did. And he found that the his finding was that the death was consistent with homicide and was not consistent with natural causes. That's what he said. Later on, when he's interviewed years later about what he had found back in 2015 or 16, uh, he said she was murdered.
And because you put so much pressure on law enforcement, they eventually found 11 bodies. But unfortunately, the fire extinguisher was on fire because James Burke was the chief of police for Suffolk County. And he wasn't very compatible with conducting an investigation of these serial killings.
You're right about that.
Give us an insight into James Burke.
Well, that insight is very difficult to pinpoint because it's broad. He's done an awful lot of things that suggest very grave difficulties with this entire situation, dealing with these murdered people. Burke got his start in the public eye when, as a boy, a young boy in Smithtown in Suffolk County, his friends, his close buddies, murdered a 12-year-old boy by shoving rocks down the little boy's throat, John Pius. And Burke knew about what had happened. We don't know if Burke was really present when it occurred or not to this day, but Burke became the instrumental witness against his friends at the behest of the prosecutor at the time, whose name was Thomas Spota. And Spota went on to become the district attorney who was in charge at the time that the Gilgo Beach case was going forward. So Burke became, through infamy, he became well known from the outset of his career. It was Spota who promoted him, helped him to go into the police department, become a cop, and move up in the ranks. I don't think it was just Spota who moved him up in the ranks, but it certainly he had some influence on that. Burke moved up in the ranks of the police department, and that's where this becomes important, because while he was moving up, he also had a predilection for sex workers. And he got caught with a sex worker named Loretta Rickenbacker, who became his girlfriend and eventually the mother of his child. And he had picked her up on Albany Avenue, a place notorious for prostitution, and he had made her his girlfriend. But he left her with his gun, and he got busted in rank when that was discovered. This happened twice. He was busted in rank twice for these, soliciting the sex workers. I became the lawyer for Loretta Rickenbacker. And so I got firsthand from her what actually occurred with Burke. And what she said was he picked her up when he saw her bending over and he thought she was sexy over on Albany Avenue, and then took her in his police car in the back seat, and he committed uh, oral sex on her, fellatio on her, in the car, in the police car. That's how it started. And then she ended up going to a house in Ronkonkoma that Burke owned with Burke there to have sex and smoke crack. And that this happened frequently. And by the way, we had another person who identified Burke as it was Burke's girlfriend, actually, who was a hairdresser of some kind, owning a hair salon, who was running a prostitution ring out of a beeper uh, in Burke's house. And she also worked out of the house in Ronkonkoma. So Loretta's story coincided with this other lady's story. It turned out that by sheer coincidence, I had um, used the same private investigator who uh, investigated the case of Burke and his relationship with the hair salon lady, because the hair salon lady was married and her husband had her investigated. And so the investigator, uh, Phyllis Gagliardi, was my investigator just by sheer coincidence of the many coincidences in this case. And so she confirmed to me what I learned from Loretta, and that she actually ended up chasing Burke one day, following him, and he tried to run away, get away from her, because he was dressed in girls' clothing. Loretta told me that Burke liked to dress in girls' clothing. He liked to be the passive of the two, but now and then he would get aggressive. Uh, so this is the picture of Burke. This is the man who is in charge of and made in charge of the investigation of 10 sex workers who are dead. And he is himself completely and deeply involved with sex workers. He also apparently gets pulled over by police in Brooklyn because he goes there to solicit sex workers, and they send him home saying, we know who you are, and they let him go. But his involvement with the sex workers for years should tell you that there's something seriously wrong with having him in charge of the police department's investigation. And how he started in that was only days after Shannon Gilbert's bones were located, he was appointed as chief of police. And he therefore ran the investigation from that point on. But before he did that, he was also the chief of detectives for the district attorney's office, that is for Tom Spota. And in that capacity, he was informally in charge of that investigation. So he was completely suffused in that and intertwined in that investigation right from the start. And it's Burke who then takes over. And it's Burke, with the help of Spota, who then told the FBI to stand down, leave off on the investigation, the New York State Police Department, the New York City Police Department, and the Nassau County Police Department, and the Jersey City Police Department, which was investigating Shannon as a missing person because she came from Jersey City. So all those departments were tossed out, and at least one of them in New Jersey, run by a very expert detective, Cesar Camacho, was deeply involved in the investigation of Shannon Gilbert, and he was cut off and sent home. Wasn't allowed to do it by Burke.
So we have a police chief that is violent, likes to smoke crack, likes to cross dress, and he's in charge of an investigation of all these prostitutes that were murdered. I don't
And he's
really think
more than just a prostitute solicitor. He's also a real pervert in his own right. In that, when a drug addict named Christopher Loeb breaks into his car, breaks into Burke's car and steals his duffel bag, it's filled with child porn, uh, and according to Loeb, and that's why Loeb gets beat up by Burke in the precinct. So it's all related to sexual perversion. And if you don't want to believe that Burke himself was really directly involved in perversion and therefore utterly untrustworthy to be running this investigation, just last year, after he goes to jail for beating up Loeb and he's out, he goes up on Bald Hill here in Farmingville in Suffolk County, which is there's a Vietnam memorial there. It's a big hill where notoriously male uh, gay men go there to meet anonymously with other gay men to do hookups, and prostitution is rampant there as well, male prostitution. I've had clients from that hill, so everybody knows that hill. Everybody knows what goes on there. Burke was there not even a year ago, and he solicited a man, and he wanted to give the man oral sex, and the man turned out to be an undercover for the state park authorities or marshals or whatever they're called, and he gets busted. He's still facing charges. He hasn't finished pleading on those charges as we speak. So Burke was also, you say, ACDC when it came to his sexual preferences. And he was also completely involved with prostitution in the worst way. This is not the man to have been running this investigation.
Christopher Loeb, who ripped off his bag of tricks, said that he found not only child pornography, but he found a snuff film in his possessions. And
yeah, that's true. He said that, but he didn't say that for a few years.
Did you find Christopher Loeb credible?
Questionable.
He's a heroin addict. I mean, heroin addicts can have spotty veracity, shall we say?
Oh,
But
he has bizarre behaviors. He makes completely ridiculous claims. He doesn't seem to be all there.
And then there were a couple of district attorneys. There was Thomas Spada and Christopher McPartland, who were covering up for Burke. So it sounds like this entire police division is very corrupted.
Yes, it was, and in terms of this investigation, it certainly was. I mean, there's other parts of this story that are really important that the police department utterly neglected, and to this day still neglect. We've brought these other facts that show the likelihood that Shannon was murdered, the overwhelming likelihood that she was murdered. We brought those to the attention of the police to no avail, and they haven't investigated these things. One of them, for example, is this. At the very beginning of the events of May 1st, 2010, Shannon, according to Joe Brewer, the John, and according to Shannon's driver, Michael Pack, Shannon received a call from Brewer to solicit her for sex at his house in Oak Beach while she was in Manhattan with Pack. She gets the call at midnight, or approximately midnight, and agrees to go to all the way out to Oak Beach, a 50-mile drive, approximately, in an isolated place, for an alleged $300 tryst. Now, that's the basic story that starts this case off. She goes with Pack. Brewer meets them at the lock gate, the barred gate, for the association, the Oak Beach Association. He takes them back to Brewer's house, and then we have all the other events that I've already described. Well,
Go
it
ahead.
never sat well with me, that story. And I've taken a deposition several times of Brewer and Pack, and each time they tell me the story, it changes about how this initial event took place. If you believe Brewer and Pack that Shannon went there for just a tryst with Brewer, then you have to believe that she would be willing to do that for either no money, if you listen to Pack, where he said no money was ever discussed, or which is nonsense, absurd for a sex worker to not have discussed money. And if you believe Brewer, that it was for $300 for an hour. And then when she got there, she upped the hours again to 3 hours. Now, I've learned a great deal about sex work by my investigations in this case and people I've represented. And one thing I'm very certain about is that sex workers don't go to trysts without arranging a payment in advance. And they usually don't take the deal unless they're paid in advance. And typically, sex workers, the deal is when you make a one-on-one arrangement, the deal is when the guy is finished, so to speak, meaning that he's ejaculated, he's done. The tryst ends. So if that happens in 15 minutes, that's the cost of doing business. If you get up to an hour for that, it's rare, therefore, that time is extended. This time was allegedly extended for 2 more hours, and no money was exchanged, if you believe Pack and Brewer. They're not believable. I could never understand that story. It never made much sense. And now with investigation that we've done with the help of Lena here, who's really a great, fantastic investigator and computer expert in technology and investigation, we were able to break through the story, and the story that the police department never followed up whatsoever. And that's this. We found out that Shannon Gilbert worked in New Jersey for a ring that was one of the biggest rings in the United States, one of the rings that crossed state boundaries, no problem, and ran very high-end sex workers. They weren't $300 a night, and you didn't have to drive all the way out to Oak Beach for the lousy $300. And if you knew Michael Pack, I might say, as I know him well, and had lunch with him, and then observed his behavior and how he worried about every penny. Michael Pack is not one to have driven all the way with his SUV out to Oak Beach, 50 miles away, and come back and paid the gas for that without getting more than $50, which is what he claimed he would have gotten. That's all a lie, complete lie. What was true is that Shannon was a very high-end sex worker. And when we found out that the man in charge of her sex work was a man named Joseph Ruiz, and Ruiz becomes a national figure because when he gets busted in New Jersey for running a sex ring as well as a coke ring, and goes to jail for that, one of the indicted people along with him was one of his highest end workers, and that was Shannon Gilbert. So she gets busted, and when she disappears on May the 1st, 2010, when she disappears, Ruiz is still under indictment, and we believe that Shannon was as well. So here she is, a girl who made, according to the records that we have, the actual records, she would have made anywhere from $2,500 to $5,000 per session. Would she go at midnight on May 1st and drive all the way out to Suffolk County for a lousy $300? No, that's a lie. The whole story is made up. But what is much more obvious is what's in the records. If that's the kind of numbers that she was making, and she was working for an agency as was Pack, who was a human trafficker who went to jail in a felony case in California for human trafficking, where he worked for an agency, as they're called. There's the sex trafficking organizations. They both worked for this agency, and it was run by Ruiz. And you start to put the pieces together, you know that she had to go out. She went to Oak Beach with Pack to do something she never did before, and she'll never do again, as she herself said, for a lot of money. What could that be? Well, it also so happens, and it's a fact that should be considered. I don't say it's necessarily related, but it's certainly a big consideration, was that it was Walpurgis night. That's the night of the witches, recognized by the witchcraft people as their night. It was that night after midnight. And she gets the call allegedly at midnight and goes out to Suffolk County for what purpose? In the marsh in Oak Beach. Something else was going on there, something much more heinous than just a single hit tryst with Brewer, which made no sense.
Are you surmising that there was some type of occult ceremony?
There's a potentiality of a cult ceremony that was going on and that she was a part of it. Potential. It needs to be investigated because there's other circumstances that support the theory as well. And we really need to look into it. But before we even get to that point and look into it, as we have here, and Lena can talk about it, before we look into that, let's look back into Ruiz. And he was connected with another fellow. They were running the ring out of a house in New Jersey, in Jersey City.
So Ruiz, and back in 2009, he has a network called World Class Party Girls and something called Triple A Party Girls. Shannon is actually arrested back in 2007, and she's attributed as working for Lace Party Girls. So all the way back in 2007, she's working for this very high-end network. If you go onto the Wayback Machine, you can still see the Lace Party Girls and World Class Party Girls websites that Ruiz set up. They're registered to him. If you do like a reverse who is lookup, it's actually Ruiz who set up these websites through GoDaddy. So if you go to these websites, average rate for an hour is around $3,500. So when Ruiz ends up going down in 2009, the search warrant is served at an address in Jersey City, 173 Sherman Avenue. 173 Sherman Avenue was owned by a guy named Paul Benson, a really wealthy landowner in the area. He owned a lot of buildings, businesses. He was a contractor. Paul Benson, I think only about 6 months after Ruiz and Shannon are co-indicted on a human trafficking, I believe it was promoting prostitution, money laundering, cocaine trafficking. 6 months after they are indicted together on these charges, Paul Benson, the owner of the building that Shannon's escort ring was run out of, goes down for transmitting and having child pornography. And this is where it gets really bizarre. The law enforcement agency that led the investigation was Suffolk County Police Department. And
let me just stop you there.
Dominic Verone.
In New Jersey.
In New Jersey, what is the Suffolk County Police Department doing in an investigation of a sex ring dealing with porn in New Jersey, in Jersey City in particular, and dealing with Joseph Ruiz in particular? And the head of the Suffolk County Police Force Task Force, or whatever it was called, in that investigation was Dominic Verone. Dominic Verone was the chief of police in Suffolk County before Burke got in the picture, and he is the one who claimed that Shannon Gilbert drowned, and that's how she died. It was Verone who was in charge of all these things, and never once did we ever hear from the police department that Verone had any prior connection to Shannon Gilbert whatsoever. Yet he did. So
for my viewers and listeners who aren't familiar with, Suffolk County is a county in New York, and they ostensibly investigated a case in New Jersey, which they shouldn't have had to investigate. And you were able to get a hold of a cab driver that gave you some amazing information.
Yeah. We also, one of the things that Michael Pack claimed was that he left the scene on May 1st in the morning hours because when Shannon ran away, he couldn't find her. And so he just figured that she got a ride home somehow in this desolate place. And so he left and he went to a place in Queens, New York, to drop off some money that he had picked up, or that he was going to meet a person to pick up the money from at a place along the Long Island Expressway in Queens, in Horace Harding Boulevard, near a Dunkin' Donut. I went, I saw the place, I know it's there, and I found the man who he claimed to have met, and I spoke to him. He's in Miami now, and the man told me all about what he thought happened that morning when he met, or that day rather, when he met up with Pack. And what's interesting is that the police department explicitly said that they had checked out Pack's story and corroborated it so that it was a true story. And the only way they could have corroborated it, and they even said that they met the person, I think, was to have talked to this man who met with Pack to give Pack money to be deposited with the sex trafficking organization. That's what Pack claimed to happen that morning. And he claimed that the money that he got, he was only supposed to drop it off, and that's what he did. It's for one of these ATM type machines. In any event, that man was also a driver of sex workers. I got to speak to the guy, and sure enough, yep, he said he did meet with Pack that morning. Nothing about dropping off any money. And they both met together. And this man said the Suffolk County Police Department never even contacted him. So all the facts and circumstances around the beginning of this case were completely obscured or obfuscated by the police department or ignored.
And you did find this taxi driver that was able to show, or that told you that Huberman and Shannon Gilbert had previously met.
Yes, we did. We one of the things doing what we're doing here on this show today is valuable, not least because it helps to generate witnesses, people who remember things, people who come forward suddenly. It triggers their conscience, and so they come. A taxi driver we spoke with, who has no skin in the game, no axe to grind, nothing that she wanted in any way. She was a banker by day, a taxi driver by night. In Suffolk County, she was called to by her, the dispatcher that runs a taxi company that she worked for. And she was called to go to a motel, the Sayville Motor Lodge on Sunrise Highway, and pick up a girl who was calling from the bathroom and who was scared. So she went there, and she was told to honk the horn or flash her lights or something. I forget exactly, but she did. I think she did both. And suddenly, out of the door burst a girl who ran and got into her car. A few minutes later, Rex Huberman came out, and the taxi driver clearly identified him. And she knew. She said Shannon sat in the back seat of the car and told her. For almost an hour, they talked about her, circumstances and what had happened in the motel room that night. And Shannon had also told her about Shannon's personal life, her boyfriend, her sisters, her mother. And this taxi driver knew all those details. And so the driver then eventually dropped her off with another driver because the driver had to leave. Our driver had to leave. And then she dropped Shannon off with another driver who would take her to the train station, and she'd go into the city. So what had happened, according to our driver, whose name is anonymous, is that Shannon told her that when Shannon had reluctantly hooked up with this fellow to have an affair, and it was going to be $3,000. So that makes more sense when you consider what I told you about Shannon's work and how much she really would get for her work. And so she came to the motel with this fellow, and he showed her an envelope and let her see that it was, fat envelope, put it on the dresser, and told her that was going to be for her and for her family. And this guy would use the persuasive way of getting these girls to show up, including Shannon, by telling them, what a nice guy he was and how he would help them out and so forth. That happened here. But when he went in, he acted very strangely, she said, and then he went into the bathroom. And I didn't know whether there was a sex act that took place. I doubt it. Doesn't sound like it. And when he went into the bathroom, she checked the envelope, and it was filled with paper. So she knew she was in trouble. And when he came out of the bathroom, she bolted in and locked the door and called the taxi. Now, that's much more in keeping with what a sex worker would normally do in terms of escape. That would be not call 911, but call a taxi, which is what Shannon did. And so that happened. So now the driver leaves, and she hears no more from either one of them until days later, the dispatcher calls her again to pick up a guy near a bar in either Bohemia or Ronkonkoma. Sort of, they're very next door to each other, those two areas, and they're sort of in the middle of the island in Suffolk County. So she goes to pick it, and sure enough, there's the guy that she saw come out of the motel. That was Horman. Only he's got a lanyard on. He looks like he's a cop. A lanyard with a little plaque on it, and he comes out of the bushes when she pulls up by the bar, and jumps in the car and tells her that they're going to go to a place, a forest, and that was not the destination place that the dispatcher had given her. So she knew she was in trouble, and she had a discussion with the guy, and the guy threatened to kill her, and he pulled a gun. And she refused to move her cab. She said, "I'll give you the keys." And apparently she threw the keys on the seat, said, "I'll do anything you want, but I'm not going to any forest." And she got out of the car. And then he got out of the car, and she got back in and took the keys and drove away. So as she drove away, she encounters another police car that's on its way down with its lights off down the street. She tells the police officer, she stops him and says, "Look, one of yours is back there and he's acting crazy," because she thought he was a cop with the lanyard on. And she recognized him to be the guy that she met in the motel. She believes that the guy purposely set up this latest tryst, which could easily have been done by simply calling the dispatcher. That's her story. She was very credible. I wasn't the only one who checked out her credibility for many hours, but I met with her face to face with the commissioner of the Suffolk County Police Department, the reformer, Rodney Harrison. And the two of us, I rented a place in New York to sit so we would be quiet in New York City. He came, and the two of us vetted her for almost 2 hours, and he found her to be credible.
And you also got someone to come forward who was the girlfriend of a vice squad detective in New York City. And she said that the vice squad cop and her picked up a prostitute in Manhattan and drove her out to Rex Huerman's place.
Yes, that's Lorraine. She doesn't mind using her name. And Lorraine was not a sex worker. Lorraine was a swinger. And she claims that this detective, whose name we knew, she told us, went with her in a car, and a person he had picked up, a sex worker type, who was bedraggled and looked like she was fearful and kind of dirty, and she was in the back seat. And they went to a tryst for swingers in a house in Massapequa Park, which turned out to be the Huerman house. While they were traveling, one of the significant facts that this woman knew that you wouldn't think she would have been able to know from the press was that the little girl in the back seat, the young woman or in the back seat, was sort of bent over. She noticed that she was bent over. She didn't seem, she didn't sit straight. She would always sit sort of crooked. And it turned out that Karen Vergata had been in a car accident and had hurt her spine so that she would bend over, exactly as was described by Lorraine. And Lorraine, they get to the Massapequa Park home. Asa Ellerup is there along with Rex, and Rex goes downstairs with the detective. The detective, by the way, he was a narcotics detective in New York City, in Brooklyn, and she told us his name. We checked out the name. He did exist. We gave her a spread of pictures. She picked him out immediately, and it turned out, yep, that was him, matched the name, and he had been charged with raping a girl, and it was in the New York Times, reported twice. So, this was all sounding very real. In any event, they leave. And before they leave, Asa Ellerup had refused to engage in sex, according to Lorraine. And Lorraine asked her why, and she wouldn't really explain. But later on, Osa's lawyer, that's Asa Ellerup, the wife of Rex Heuermann, Osa's lawyer, Macedonio, went on national television to say that, of course, she didn't have sex. Why would she? She was pregnant. And it turns out she was pregnant. And the date, this was in February when this event occurs, and her daughter was born at exactly the time that she should have been if Lorraine rather was telling the truth. So they leave, and before they leave, Rex is out in the backyards in a big canister setting a fire at 1:00 in the morning, which kind of upset Lorraine. And she gets in the car with her boyfriend, and they don't leave in the same car they came in. So it's very likely that the detective knew in advance, Rex. And they see Brigada in the window, acting very scared. And so it upsets Lorraine, and she says to her boyfriend, why are we leaving her behind? And the boyfriend tells her, don't worry, they're just playing a game, nothing going on. With that, who turns out to be Karen Vergata, bolts out of the house naked and runs across in front of the house, and they leave. But they don't take her. So she claims that as soon as she saw Vergata's picture on national television, she recognized her as the girl that was in the car. Now, whether you believe her or not, who knows? I have no corroboration except what I've explained to you.
And she connects Heuermann and Vergata. Vergata was one of the prostitutes that was murdered, and Heuermann isn't charged with that murder.
Correct.
We've got, I think Heuermann is charged with 6 murders at this point.
Yes.
And there's 11 bodies that have been found. I'm sure that there might be more bodies that we haven't found. And
no doubt. We have witnesses who've come forward about their encounters with Heuermann in Virginia. We have more than one. We've had one from South Carolina, one from Florida, one from Philadelphia, one from New Jersey, one from upstate New York, one in Manhattan, one in the borough of Queens, who now lives in Oklahoma, and others as well.
And it becomes interesting here to mention that Heuermann had apartments and residences that are registered to his name in a lot more places than just Long Island and Manhattan. A lot of people talk about his activities simply in that capacity as being relegated to New York. Some people talk about how he had a timeshare in Las Vegas. People have read depositions where they know he would drive down to Cocoa Beach, Florida, but he had apartments and other types of houses registered to his name in North Carolina, South Carolina, Atlanta, Smyrna, Georgia, Anchorage, Alaska, Massachusetts, and North Reading, and interestingly enough, West Warwick, Rhode Island. Earlier, Mr. Ray mentioned to you that James Burke had been part of an escort ring with a woman who was based in Ronkonkoma. Well, that woman has since moved to West Warwick, Rhode Island. And it's not a huge town. It's pretty small. They live about 10 minutes away from each other, 5 to 10 minutes away from each other in West Warwick, Rhode Island. And there's another interesting piece to this, too. When Burke is caught in the park soliciting sex from an undercover officer, his, I believe it was the Daily Mail reported that he had Rhode Island plates on his car.
Absolutely, and take up with the Anchorage connection, and Lena will speak a little bit about this, but just let me say that we know that Rex Hoyman, had property interests in Arizona, Nevada, and Alaska. And those interests were that he would go there and apparently try to get hunting licenses in these places, but particularly in Anchorage in Alaska. And what's weird about that is that his wife, Asa Ellerup, has a sister who lives in Massapequa Park, which is a tiny community on the south shore of Long Island. And she lived about 5 minutes away, the sister, from the Hoyman household. And the sister, whose name was Carolyn,
Joanna.
I'm sorry, Joanna. I said wrong one. Sorry. The sister, who's Joanna, claimed not to know anything at all about what went on at the Hoyman house, and in fact said she didn't even know where her sister lived. They were 5 minutes apart. That sister, by all the evidence that we've garnered, is deeply involved in the practice of and the study of witchcraft. And she ends up getting a place in Anchorage. And it's only 5 minutes or by way of a drive from where one of the serial killers named Smith, who just got convicted recently of serial killing, he was located in Alaska as well. And there's yet another sex fiend who was one of the serial killers who's well known to the world, named Hansen, who was a hunter of girls in Anchorage, all of them living within driving distance of one another. And there's a fourth one as well she'll tell you about. But the sister, Joanna, gets a place in Anchorage, Alaska, and I believe applies for a license there.
Yeah, she has a pharmacy license. So she's a pharmacist, this woman, Joanna. It's interesting. She has a very well evidenced interest in the occult, Wicca specifically, and perhaps Druidism. She actually ran a blog on Quora that was called The Forbidden Thricefold Path, which she called I might not be quoting directly, but this was the gist, a safe place for people interested in esotericism, Gnosticism, and Wicca, the practice of witchcraft. I found reviews of hers that she's left all over the internet for Gnostic texts and various Wiccan books. She also ran for office in Suffolk County, and she identified herself as a Gnostic Christian. So she's very interested in the occult. On her Facebook page, it's still up. If you choose to peruse it, you'll find various images of witches, and she's
interested in cannibalism. She's interested in human sacrifice.
She posted pictures of books that her mom owned, and in sort of a quippy, look at these books my mother owned, and all of the books related to occultism. One of the books was, I believe, called Harvest Moon. It was about some agricultural ritual sacrifice. They're horror books. Another was sort of about a Mansonoid conspiracy, to quote Pynchon. But this Joanna, the sister of Asa Ellerup, who lives only a few minutes away from the Ellerup and Hoyerman household, she also had an apartment in Anchorage, Alaska, as well as Fairbanks, Alaska, and she had pharmacy licenses there, I believe, from 2014, and she continues to hold them. Hoyerman has hunting licenses that begin in 2010 in Anchorage, Alaska. He mentioned to you a guy named Smith. I'm not sure if you follow your Anchorage news at all, but I
I don't keep up on Anchorage news.
Mhm.
understandable. You are a New Yorker, but in Anchorage, very recently, there was a famous case that came up of a man who was murdering sex workers and he was torturing them and making snuff films of them. And I think the snuff film aspect is very important here when we get to Heuermann as well, because part of what he was doing in his planning document says dispose of pictures. And he actually had quite a collection of snuff films and torture porn films that actually go back to the early 90s. But this guy in Anchorage, Brian Stephen Smith, his trial just finished. He murdered two different women and filmed snuff films of them. He lived a 5-minute drive from Joanna Ellerup's house in Anchorage. He also possessed hunting licenses in the same area that Rex Heuermann did. And if you know anything about Alaska sporting game permits, you can't hunt game in Alaska without somebody being your guide. Brian Stephen Smith and Rex Heuermann have very similar interests. Part of Brian Stephen Smith's job was actually liaising with architects, and he was a woodworker, an expert craftsman, according to his wife, very into hunting, and a big weapons collector, just like Heuermann.
Remember that Heuermann also is into woodworking and making furniture at his home. And there's wood chips that are found around the bodies of 3 of the girls that are involved here. So
Yeah, there's just a tremendous amount of coincidences and locational, geographic, implausible densities of people who are interested in murdering other people and creating snuff films of them.
and the um, the human connection as well is that, well, I don't call it a connection. It's perhaps another coincidence, but it's a coincidence that Smith's wife behaved almost exactly the way Asa Ellerup has behaved in this case, supporting her husband through the trial when it's obvious what he was doing, and the evidence is overwhelming. And you could speak about her.
Yeah, she as well is an occultist and involved in what appears to be Druidism and the Society for Creative Anachronisms. So some of your viewers might know of the Society for Creative Anachronisms' relationship to Walter Breen and Marion Zimmer Bradley, but it's long been, like cosplay and specifically that kind of it has long been affiliated with people who might have some perverse interests.
And before we forget, I just some of the things I say, they're from memory, not from my notes. If you want to correct some of the things I say.
Not necessarily.
So you made a lot of noise about this, a lot of noise when you took on Shannon Gilbert's case. And then finally, there was a police chief who was a drug addict, a cross-dresser, liked to beat up prostitutes. So he was kind of problematic as someone that you could get justice from. But finally, in January in 2022, the Suffolk County District Attorney formed a task force. And within a couple of months, Rex Heuermann was detained because of leads that had been given to them 10 years before.
Well, yeah, what happened really was that there was fairly well-known and obvious evidence that the police department had. I remember years ago, I've been in this case now for going into 13 years. Years ago, I can't even pinpoint the exact time, but we knew that the towers that the phone calls were pinging off of, that Heuermann was making, for example, to Melissa Barthelomew's sister, Melissa being one of the dead girls, and up in Buffalo, in Lockport in Buffalo, we knew that where the calls were coming from. So you could trace the calls all the way back to Massapequa Park, and I always assumed or thought that the pinging of the calls, the direction of the calls, suggested that either whoever was doing the calling was coming from Manhattan and driving along the South Shore route back to Massapequa Park, or had taken the Long Island Railroad on the South Shore line and was making these calls. But we knew that the Massapequa Park area was the destination area of the calls. And it turns out that the police obviously knew that, and also knew all along that the man who killed Costello was a man who drove an avalanche. So it wouldn't have been, we didn't know that. The police didn't give that to the public, I guess, to their great loss. But
And that was the first, Sandra
crazy.
Costello. Sandra Costello was the first victim that was found in 1993.
Amber.
Yeah,
Go
you're
ahead.
talking about Sandra Castilla. She was the 1993 woman who was typically attributed to Bitroff. And I believe the tip that the police claim that led to the discovery as to Rex Hoyerman was from the roommate of Amber Lynn Costello, the Green Chevy Avalanche.
That's who I meant, Amber Lynn Costello.
Yeah, so they could have taken, all they had to do was go to the area around Massapequa Park as the destination of the calls, and, draw a circle, draw a square, whatever you'd like, and then go and find out within that range who owned an avalanche. and that's what, when they formed the task force, they finally did that. And that task force was formed by Ray Tierney, who was the new DA at the time and still is, and Rodney Harrison, the reformed police commissioner who was appointed. So it didn't take them long to figure out what I might say was fairly obvious, that the police should have been looking at all along and didn't. And one has to ask, with this suburban police force, I was told it was the 5th largest suburban police force in the country, one of the highest paid in the country. And you would think that in a place where we have an intense amount of murder on Long Island, that the police department would have figured out how to do what I just mentioned, how to do that kind of make that kind of an effort. So you can only conclude from that their negligence was gross or worse, that it was willful.
So you were pummeled in the media. You didn't retract anything. And then finally in 2022, I believe, one of the Suffolk County District, or actually it was the police chief, Rodney Harrison, actually you and Rodney Harrison put on a press conference.
That is true. It was a sheer surprise to everyone. But Rodney and I had become friends, and I had exchanged information with him. So he trusted me, and I trusted him. And even though we didn't agree, he being the head of the police department, he spoke what he learned from the police department. So we didn't even agree on the nature of Shannon's death, because he was taking his info from the people who told him how this death occurred. So the cops, in other words. So anyway, I was about to conduct another deposition of the John Joseph Brewer that I was allowed by the court to do. And I was, actually had pulled up in the parking lot to go into the building to start that deposition when Rodney called me and said, let's hold a joint press conference. And so that was palatable to me. And when I finished the deposition of Brewer, we came back to my office, we met here, and we held a joint press conference. And the main purpose of the conference was very simple. I had been taking a bashing and a beating for the work I had done, as we know, and there's all these.
I read the accounts.
Reddit internet little trolls and little beasts who say nasty little things and don't know what they're talking about. But anyway, the media had treated me well enough. I can't say they hadn't. That's different. But in any event, the media listens to the trolls, so that was not a good thing. Rodney said, let's get rid of that. Let's forego all that, and we'll talk. And what we did was we called the conference, the press came, and right here in this office, outside, he told the police, the people through the media, he said, look, this is a tough investigation. If you don't want to talk to the police, if you're afraid of the police, you have any other reason not to want to speak to the police, which there could be many, you can call John Ray. That's what you should do.
And you must have felt vindication at that point.
Of course I did. I felt, yes, very much so. From the commissioner of the police department, the prior commissioners wouldn't even talk to us.
I wrote an article for the Alternative Weekly in Minneapolis. There was a woman who was, excuse me, there was a woman who ran an organization that helped take prostitutes off the street. And she was saying that there was a serial killer at work. And she was a little crazy, so she was just kind of written off. But I looked into it, and I think I found 48 prostitutes who had been stabbed, beaten, or strangled in the previous 8 years. And I went to the Minneapolis police and I said, are you sure you want to say there's no serial killer? And I went to the St. Paul police and I said, are you sure you want to say there's, with my list, are you sure you want to say there's no serial killer? And finally, a task force was formed. But myself, I don't think there was malfeasance in the respect that, like with James Burke, I don't think there was malfeasance like that. I kind of felt that my take on it was these were just the law enforcement felt, well, these are just prostitutes and who cares? We're not going to spend all this money on a task force. That's what I thought about it.
You mean, I can't, I don't have a particular theory that I'm wedded to. There are a number of reasonable theories about what happened here, unlike what you experienced in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And I know you wrote a great book about it. So we don't necessarily have the same facts here with the same conclusions, but I'm not wedded to one particular view. But one view is that there's one thing that is true, that you could say by now is pretty established, that the police neglected this case in a very big way, such that we have the results that we see now, where so much evidence was destroyed, disappeared, and so forth during the time since these girls disappeared. However, are the police merely neglectful? No, that can't be. But does that mean that they were just grossly neglectful? Possibly. Or that they were willful, that they did intentionally cover up this case, and then you have to wonder why. Those are the two main theories. Both of them are reasonable. Both of them have merit. Which one is correct? Study the facts and you come to your own conclusions.
Given the fact of James Burke and his history, I would have to say the latter. I wrote a book called The Franklin Scandal, a story of power brokers, child abuse, and betrayal. And the chief, it was a pedophile network that was run out of Omaha, Nebraska. And the chief of police was one of the perps. So of course it was going to be covered up. Mm-hmm. And that's really unfortunate that psychopaths and sociopaths become police chiefs. I mean,
you wonder how that happened. And I wonder that myself with the Burke situation. Made no sense. And even though Spota was a powerful figure before he became a DA, he was, he had been after he quit the DA's office and became a private attorney, he represented the police, various police unions. So he had a nice little practice going there. And then he became the DA. But in all that time that Burke advances from a police cadet all the way up to become chief of police after being busted and ranked twice, and having people say, this guy's problem, watch out for him. He makes it anyway. That can't have occurred because of the direct or indirect influence of just one man, Thomas Spota. He didn't have that much power. So you have to then say, well, how did he get there? How did Burke get to these positions? And there has to be within the rank and file of the upper part of the rank and file, people who knew, men and women who knew that Burke was a problem, knew what the problem was, and nonetheless promoted him up the ranks. And if we know police at all, one thing I do know about police is that they notice things. They pay close attention to details, and especially in their employment and as to the circumstances in employment. You know, it's a never-ending gossip amongst the police about who's doing what to whom and so on within their own ranks. So the one thing that they would have noticed is that Burke was bringing Loretta Rickenbacker to police affairs and strutting her around after he dressed her up. And then he would bring this other woman as well at another time to the same police functions. And you mean to tell me that nobody in the police department noticed anything about James Burke and his proclivities and his circumstances and the way he behaved? I had an employee come to me from Suffolk County who was looking to get a promotion. And to get that promotion, she had to go to she was told, you have to go see Chief Burke. So Chief Burke tells her to meet him at the Marriott Hotel and for dinner. And sure enough, he proposes to her, go upstairs and sleep with me or you don't get the promotion. Nobody believes that until you know more about Burke, and then you find out that's perfectly reasonable. What's the point? The point is that within the ranks of the police department, everybody knew who he was, or many people did, and the higher up people pushed him up anyway. So the only reason they could have done that is because they've got some things to answer for themselves. And I went to the trial of Thomas Spoda in federal court for one day. I was there, and I learned when I was at that trial that three of the high-ranking police department white shirts, they call them, right? You know, the guys with the stars. Three of them out of three who testified were having adulterous affairs. Now that puts you in a position when you're a high-ranking police officer to be extorted, to be intimidated. And you have to start thinking about that possibility here, that there are people within that police department who knew very well there's something deeply wrong with what happened here, and that Burke was somehow involved in it, and maybe others as well, and they're covering for one another. Well, that's possible, isn't it?
I've written 3 books that have to deal with political blackmail in Washington, D.C. And you see people that are compromised going up the ladder. I mean, if you're compromised, it's going to help your career. I got to a blackmail photographer, and I've used this analogy quite a bit. And I got to this blackmail photographer, and I was trying to figure all this out. And I said, how does it work? And he said, once you're compromised, it's like you're on a yacht, and it's a beautiful yacht, and it's a beautiful day, and you can have anything you want on this yacht. But if you decide to get off the yacht, the people on the yacht are going to make sure that you drown. So there is zero incentive for people to get off the yacht, and they just keep bumping each other up. I mean, that's how I believe it works. And one last thing, I want to thank you for spending so much time on the Nick Bryant podcast.
Sure.
You don't think that Rex Heuermann is the alpha and the omega of these murders?
I think something really important to mention here is that Rex Heuermann is, you know, people don't talk about his family very often, but he's part of a pretty connected family. For him to be solely responsible, considering the family connections he has, and for him to have been the only person who is involved in all of these killings strains credulity for me. His uncle, George Heuermann, he was the number 2 cop in Nassau County, right below the commissioner of police. He went to the FBI Academy. There's pictures of him in newspapers shaking the hands of Dwight Eisenhower, J. Edgar Hoover. Rex's dad, Theodore Heuermann, he was affiliated with defense contractors in Long Island. He worked for MIT. His name actually appears as an external distributee on an unclassified Apollo mission manual. And interestingly enough, Rex's cousin, Kenneth Heuermann, is a satanic ritual abuser up in Camillus, New York. I'm not sure if that's the correct way to pronounce it. Camillus. But according to a lawsuit that was settled quite recently, Rex Heuermann's cousin, Kenneth, who was the best man at George's wedding. Keep in mind, George is the FBI Academy guy, #2 cop. Kenneth had abused a child named R.W. He committed satanic ritual abuse against her, and one of the things that goes on, according to R.W., is the filming of child pornography. So when you view that, all of these family connections, military defense contractors, child ritual sex abuse, all of these things point to a larger network than just one man.
And there's a connection as well, to finish it off. I hope I don't take too much of your time, but you can't avoid the fact that the Human family was also very much connected to the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church. And in the Catholic Church, the priests who were from Massapequa Park parishes, where Human would have grown up as and had become a communicant in the Catholic Church, were perverts themselves with sexual abuse of children in their history. One of them, Father Monsignor Alan Plaka, owned the house next door to Brewer, and Shannon knocked on his door, if you believe him, on the night that she fled from whatever she was running from. And he took that fact and he applied to the assessor's board for a reduction in the assessment of his house, and he got it by $60,000 because he said his property value was decreased because Shannon knocked on his door. That priest was a very powerful priest in the Catholic Church throughout America. He formed the Catholic Church's insurance company that governs the Catholic Church in America and made them a fortune. And Plaka, his connection was with another priest named Father Roboto, who was the head of the Holy Trinity Catholic High School in Hicksville, and Huerman's aunt was a mercy sister who worked under Roboto at that school for 30 years. And Roboto was a child pervert. I knew Roboto, I met him, and he was a sicko. He's the one who got up on the pulpit, and any Catholic listening would understand what I'm talking about, and said that Mary, the Virgin Mary, was no virgin. And this priest, who also abused children, went to jail for, he's dead now, was connected with Plaka, and all of them are connected with Huerman. So there's much more to look at here.
But you think there's some people in Huerman's nuclear family that were connected to these murders?
Well, they were connected to Huerman. How much are they connected to the murders? I guess that depends upon what else you learn about them. But one thing we are learning is not only are they involved in abuse, but some of them are involved in Satanism. Some of them are involved in child porn and child torture. So when you look at Huerman, who was himself very interested in child porn, he had child porn torture films. I mean, yeah, I think you have to look at these things, don't you?
Huerman's daughter, you've turned up a lot of stuff about Huerman's daughter and her art that she posts on the internet.
Yes, we did. And that's when we took our greatest hit. Once we exposed the things that this woman, 28-year-old, 27-year-old woman was looking at on the internet and was exchanging in some cases. And by the way, most of her art that she herself made, she wiped out. For what reason? It's gone. But what was left, what we could see that she was looking at, and one or two things that she sent, would suggest strongly that they were connected with what her father was doing. Now, you take it from there.
Even when they served the last search warrant on the family's house, only the daughter was staying at home, and on the family's kitchen table, they find a book called, I believe, a scrapbook, a homicide detective, scenes from a homicide detective's career, something like that. It was by a LAPD detective called Jack Huddleston, and he took really horrible, graphic, grisly pictures of murdered people, a lot of whom worked as prostitutes, Black Dahlia type killings. And he apparently kept this as a scrapbook just in his house. He never actually meant to publish it, and he had included kind of crass and crude captions as to the scenes of death, and often making fun of the victim. And It's a really gruesome book, and this book was just lying on the family's kitchen table. So, the daughter, the wife, if you look at her social media, you'll find a fixation on and preoccupation with gore and horror, and like occult gore and horror specifically.
And that book, by the way, was published by the head of the Satanist Church.
It was Anton LaVey, who used to be the head of the Church of Satan. He actually narrated the movie version of this book. It was like not a Mondo film, I guess you would call it, but Anton LaVey narrated this production. So
Mondo films are those kind of films that are sick things, and that's what she's looking at. So why would they even have that book? By the way, it's a book that's very popular among Satanists and in their cults, and it's kind of like, I wouldn't say it's their Bible, but in a way it is, and so the ordinary person, even the ordinary porn viewer, doesn't have that book. So they had that book on the table, on the kitchen table, when the police entered.
Evil protects itself through two primary means. I've concluded this. The first one is lies, and the second one is a viciousness that people can't comprehend. When people encounter the viciousness of evil, I mean, the true viciousness of evil, a cognitive dissonance sets in. And they just kept, like, people in my family won't read my books. So, they do not want that type of edification. That it would be too much cognitive dissonance for them. I really want to thank you two for not only coming on the Nick Bryant podcast, but I really believe without you two, Rex Schuerman would be murdering women right now. I think that you were integral in the formation of that task force.
Oh, thank you very much. It's very nice of you, Nick.
Thank you for having us.
And you guys have a great night.
Well, we'll try now.